So now we are ready to launch into the study of our first of three key composers, Bach, Mozart, and Beethoven, arguably the three most famous composers in all of Western music. We'll use each one to explore a particular era, Bach for the Baroque, Mozart for the Enlightenment, and Beethoven for the early Romantic. When I grew up, most kids took music lessons, and a lot of families had little ceramic busts of composers sitting on the piano or on the fireplace mantel. Which composers? Bach, Mozart, and Beethoven, and sometimes Brahms. I remember thinking as a kid that there must have only been 4 composers, and that 3 of them had names starting with B. Well, that's what I thought anyway. In fact, Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms were called the 3 Bs. That sounds pretty quaint now, especially in the age of cyber music, when you can download compositions from thousands of composers. But it does point out that the music written by those mega composers whose busts sat on my piano formed most people's idea of classical music. One thing I want to mention, Bach, Mozart, and Beethoven, each of these mega composers, became world famous only after his death, and each would be shocked to learn just how far his fame has spread across the globe, and how many people dearly love the music he wrote. So here we go with the story of Bach, Johann Sebastian Bach. It's a good one, and it takes us deep into the world of Baroque music. First, let's take his name. We call him Johann Sebastian Bach, or J.S. Bach. But in his time, he was known as Sebastian Bach, because his first name, Johann, was shared by many of the brothers and male cousins of his generation. He had brothers named Johann Jakob, Johann Balthasar, and Johann Christoph, and he would later give 3 of his own sons the first name of Johann. That was normal naming practice back then, and since the Bach family tree was filled with musicians, you can see where confusion would come in if people didn't use their middle names. To many music lovers, J.S. Bach's music really is Baroque music. They see the word Baroque, and they immediately hear strains of his music. Maybe they think of his chamber pieces, like the 6 famous Brandenburg concertos. Maybe they automatically think of his brilliant music for organ and harpsichord. Or maybe they think of music for choirs, the deeply admired cantatas and oratorios, and the astonishingly dramatic passions that Bach wrote, a body of music unsurpassed to this day. Even if you think you don't know Bach's music, you probably do. You'd recognize many of the melodies. They are played in a lot of situations, from weddings to Starbucks. People in charge of creating formal or elegant atmosphere often pick music by Bach or his contemporaries, Antonio Vivaldi, Georg Philipp Telemann, or Georg Friedrich Händel. Why? Because music of this era has a satisfying immediacy and a clear emotional effect. Sometimes it's energetic and exciting. Sometimes it's soothing and elegant. Sometimes it's playful and jaunty, but it's always clear in its emotional effect. And that's what I want to talk to you about now, the emotional effect, the emotional clarity. It's not accidental. There's a reason for it. There's a reason why it exists. First, I want to give you a fancy name for it, the Doctrine of the Affections, or in German, Affektlehre. In a nutshell, the Doctrine of the Affections was a well-reasoned and historically rooted understanding of the importance of projecting a clear and consistent emotion in each part of a work. Let me say that again. It was important to project a clear and consistent emotion in each part of a work. Remember how we talked about movements earlier? Well, in Baroque compositions, there were usually several short movements. Following the ruling aesthetic of the day, that is, the Doctrine of the Affections, each movement would set and maintain a single emotion. That meant keeping the same speed, same rhythm pattern, same volume, same mood, and same choice of instruments. Let's try a little demonstration. This is Bach's Brandenburg Concerto, the final movement, and it's a piece from your listening set. Energetic, isn't it? It's jaunty, it's fun, clean and crisp. And I can turn the volume down. That's something Bach couldn't do in his day. And no matter how long I leave the volume down, when I bring it back up, I come back right to that same clean, crisp emotion. That's because the doctrine of the affections demands that the entire movement keep the same emotion, the same affection. Let's try a different piece. This is from Handel's oratorio, The Messiah. It's called the Pastoral Symphony, and pastoral means of or pertaining to sheep. Think of the word pasture, or a pastor of a church. This has a very different energy. It starts sweetly, and it stays sweet and gentle, swaying and comforting all the way through the movement. It keeps the same emotion or the same affection. The doctrine of the affections was an organizing theory for all of the arts: poetry, painting, decorative arts, and certainly music. It shaped Western music for a good century and a half. And then people got tired of it. And so people began creating art that did just the opposite: change moods often, especially in music. And that's how styles progress. We'll return to this idea later. In your resource book, I've given you some dates and parameters for stylistic errors. You'll see that I outline an early, middle, and late Baroque period. We don't want to squabble over the dates, but we do need to understand what early, middle, and late mean. They mean what you might think. Early, in any style period, is when the new ideas are being devised and tried out. Middle means that the ideas have spread around and a lot of people are creating art in that style. And late means that the ideas are highly developed, refined, and most admirable, but, ironically, not very compelling to young artists anymore. And for that reason, the old styles need to move over and be replaced by new ones. Speaking of moving around, one of the factors that makes Sebastian Bach's music so interesting has to do with geography and the way he moved around. The places where Bach worked have acquired a special name: the Stations of Bach. That may sound odd, but think of how often we say a soldier is stationed at such and such base. It's the same concept. Location always affects an artist, and you could take almost any composer and look at how geography has had an impact. But Bach's geographical locations make a convenient way to examine both his life and the musical culture of his era. Let's see how it all happened. Let's go to Germany and to the small city of Eisenach, where Johann Sebastian Bach was born in 1685. He was born there somewhat by accident, as his father had only recently been sent to Eisenach to work as a town musician. Generations of his family had been musicians, as would have been normal in those days. Being a musician was a family trade, such as being a blacksmith or a cooper, a barrel maker. Trades were passed from father to son to grandson. Music making and composition were learned at the elbow of older relatives, and this is most important. A person was trained specifically for the kind of music that would be required in the job. If a father worked as a court musician, the son would be trained to write music for the court. If the father were a church musician, the son would be trained to play the organ, to conduct choirs, and to write church music. Bach's first move came from an unhappy reason. He was orphaned at age 10 and sent off on what would be a long series of changing locations. Job hopping, we might say today. He spent 5 years between 1695 and 1700 living with his older brother Johann Christoph in Ohrdruf, a small town, until he was old enough to go out on his own. Bach's brother was a trained organist, so at Ohrdruf, Sebastian Bach perfected the playing skills he had started developing under his father's tutelage back at Eisenach.
Once Sebastian was 15, he took his first real solo job at Lüneburg, a town 200 plus miles from Ohrdruf, and he kept this job for 2 years from 1700 until 1702.
Rather quickly, our Mr. Bach realized, as did the people who hired him, that he was too fancy a player to stay in that job. What they perceived as undisciplined was actually Bach's great genius. Either way, he left Lüneburg and took a job as organist at what would be his next station, the larger town of Arnstadt. And although he was in Arnstadt only a couple of years, it, like every other town where Bach worked, is today considered a Bach city. Tourists go there so that they can follow in Bach's footsteps. Bach got the Arnstadt job after he made an inspection of an organ there. Although he was only 18, he had acquired an impressive knowledge of organ technology. In fact, throughout his life, he would be brought in as a specialist to critique towns' organs and to make technical recommendations for improving them, sort of a systems analyst in today's world. Let's talk about organs. If you visit an old European church today, you might look up and see the dusty remnant of a Baroque organ's pipes. But in their day, these organs were on the cutting edge of mechanical, mathematical, and scientific technology. They operated on wind power with bellows, operated either by a player's feet for a small organ, or in the case of big organs, by huge bellows in a neighboring chamber, activated by a bellows boy, who would run up and down compressing them. Michael, if Bach or Walter or Buxtehude walked in and saw this organ, what would these people think? What would they recognize and what would be new to them?
Well, I think they'd recognize it, first of all, as an organ. I mean, we have the 3 manuals, the 3 keyboards on which Bach himself played at his home organ in the Thomaskirche. We have the pedal keyboard, but a lot of things have also changed with electricity and with the advent of mechanization. This organ is run entirely by electricity. This console, which I play, is controlling the pipes here in the large instrument by electrical impulses and electromagnets which would open up underneath the pipes. They still build organs in the old way that Bach would have been familiar with, but for example, this console at which I sit could be moved anywhere in this organ loft because it's only attached by electrical wires. Bach would have never have known that. He would recognize the stops, the sounds. He would, of course, also recognize even things like a draw knob that would pull on and take off voices. But the electronics and the mechanics have changed considerably since that time.
No candles dripping wax on the keyboards.
No candles dripping wax.
He'd like that part probably, yes.
Air conditioning,
exactly.
All these things.
And all these buttons that you can preset your combinations, right? So
absolutely. Bach would not have known these. These are preset combinations. I can press a button and see stops move. All these things done by electromagnets, and Bach would have known none of that, of course.
So who would have done it back then? Would he have had assistants?
He would have had assistants. Of course, at that point in time, they also had people pumping the bellows just to get air in the instrument itself. So, he would have assistants on each side, pulling stops, helping with things, and sometimes he would have done it himself. Music nowadays is a lot more advanced as far as the registration goes. So one person can do it all, but in those days it was simpler. They wouldn't have all the different sound changes. They would just have a sound and they would go with it if he were doing it himself, for example.
Exactly. What are some of the crazy sounds on this organ, or colorful in your opinion, or most exciting? Do you have favorites?
Well, I do. I mean, the full organ sound is obviously something which we're used to hearing. People associate that with the church or with this sort of thing, but you can also imitate a lot of other instruments. Some have the symphony orchestra, a flute. There's an oboe sound that's not too bad. There's also some other older instruments like the cromhorn from way back in the day.
Can we hear that?
Yeah, it's a riot. So we have a whole variety of things at our fingertips to try to get these different sound palettes that they would have had.
And that's part of the art of playing an organ, is it not? Especially today, where the possibilities are so large.
Almost endless. And in fact, every organ is different. I mean, no 2 organs are built alike, so you have to have a lot of training and just knowledge. If I pull a stop, what kind of sound will I get? and you just have to approach every instrument differently. Well, a pipe organ is made up of a lot of different kinds of pipes. You have everything from very small pipes to the very largest pipes you see here on our instrument, the big copper ones that go 16 and sometimes even 32 feet tall. But basically there's two different types of pipes. The first is the traditional pipe, which basically it works like a whistle. You have air coming in one end, you have a point at which the air column starts vibrating, and then you have the length of the pipe, which determines the pitch. And so I'll show you.
You sound like an organ.
Yeah, exactly, right there. And there's many, many of these, of course, in an organ. We'd have thousands in this instrument right here. The second kind of pipe is designed to imitate the orchestral reed instruments, such as an oboe or clarion or that sort of thing. And it looks a little bit different. It looks more like a trumpet or this sort of thing. But within this body right here, within the boot, there's a vibrating reed which goes back and forth. And at some point, it sets the column to vibrating. And then you have the resonator, which also is kind of like a trumpet bell, for example. And so you have a very different sound from this one. So it takes different kinds of pipes to make an organ work. You have flue pipes and reed pipes. But together they make for all the wonderful sounds we hear. These louvers right here are part of what we call a swell box or swell shades. They open and close to help provide dynamic control, volume basically, for the organist to decide whether he wants the sounds to be muffled when the shades are closed, or when the shades are open, the sound would come right out and you'd have a louder sound. So it's the way that we as musicians and organists can have more control over the volume and the dynamics of the music.
Organs clearly were one of the era's most sophisticated machines, and all of this technology reminds us of the rapid development in acoustical science in the 17th and 18th centuries, advances that directly affected the building of instruments.
Think, if you will, of the activities of 17th century scientists, starting with Galileo Galilei. Galileo's mathematical discourses concerning two new sciences offered the clearest understanding thus far on issues of frequency equivalence. Everyone learns Galileo's name, but how many learn about Marin Mersenne, a French natural philosopher often referred to as the father of acoustics? His research helped us understand the properties of sound because he either figured out or refined a lot of acoustical issues. These discoveries were followed by the work of Sir Isaac Newton, you remember his laws of gravity, as well as by an interesting French Enlightenment mathematician, encyclopedist, and philosopher named Jean d'Alembert. D'Alembert was admitted to the Academy of Sciences before he was 25 for work in applied mathematics, in particular dynamics. In 1743, he published his treatise on dynamics, in which the famous D'Alembert principle is enunciated. This principle is a generalization of Newton's third law of motion, and it states that Newton's law holds not only for fixed bodies, but also for those that are free to move. D'Alembert wrote on other subjects such as fluid dynamics, the theory of winds, and the properties of vibrating strings. Apart from his mathematical work, he is known for his contribution to Denis Diderot's famous encyclopedia, where he edited the mathematical and scientific articles. You may ask, did J.S. Bach care about these men and their scientific developments? Well, of course he did. In general, how could he not? Think of how much science and technology affect us in our lives today. Have any of you used a cell phone today or sent an email? Not to mention popping something into a microwave oven. Current science and technology always affect a person's life.
To the Pythagoreans, numbers were very mystical, and to each number they associated a particular meaning from reality. For instance, the even numbers, such as 2 and 4 and 6, were feminine, and the odd numbers were masculine, 3, 5, and 7. And then marriage, which was the union of the lowest even number and the lowest masculine number, was associated with the number 5. This got carried over to early church music, and we have various numbers that are associated with religious identities, such as 3 being for God, and for 7 for being Mary, and 10 was the perfect number, which was for various reasons. the Ten Commandments, etc. And several composers, such as Josquin, added extra notes to his musical compositions so that they would turn out to be multiples of 10. There's a wonderful motet of his in which he adds one note to the first section, one note to the second section, and 3 notes to the last section so that it would wind up having exactly 100 notes. This feature occurs later with Bach. I think you've shown the picture of him, the statue, and if you count, you find out that there are 14 buttons on his coat. And 14 was his special number because he associated the letters of the alphabet with numbers. So A was 1, B was 2, C was 3, and so on. And Bach, B-A-C-H, turns out to be 14. This shows up especially in the last work he was working on called The Art of Fugue. And in the 14th section, the Contrapunctus, he introduces his signature, which is B-A-C-H. In German, that's B flat A C B, and so those 4 notes form his little signature. We would really love to know where he was going to go from that, but unfortunately he died.
Well, now, did he expect people to hear that, or was this just sort of between his, creative genius and his soul that he did these things?
I think it was just one of those extra little things that he added in that made it interesting for him, and whether or not the listener picked it up, I'm not really sure. But as those of us who are centuries removed from him, we can look back and realize that there was actually a deeper meaning that was attached to the music than just the sound and the notes that were performed.
But more specifically, Bach followed the scientific developments that applied to instrument building and to the tuning of instruments. That's how he became an expert on organs at such a young age. Well, let's get back to Arnstadt. Bach found himself working in the same town where other of his relatives worked, including a great-uncle who had played the organ in Arnstadt for 51 years. But Bach's future was not to be in Arnstadt. He stayed only 4 years, from 1703 to 1707, and while there, he made a bit of a scandal by courting one of his singers who became his first wife, a lovely girl named Maria Barbara, who happened to be his cousin. Now, the scandal wasn't about marrying one's cousin. That was commonly done back then. The scandal was about an organist flirting with a singer from his choir. While in Arnstadt, Bach composed pieces for chorus, soloist, and instruments that are called cantatas, from the Italian verb cantare, to sing, remember? Bach wrote his cantatas throughout most of his career, and he had to compose them rapidly to be fresh for each week's services. And they had to fit many restrictions, but nonetheless, they are some of his most extraordinary creations. Yet, for all of his productivity, Bach was simply too radical and too modern for Arnstadt. In fact, in a wonderfully humorous monument sculpted in 1985 by Halle artist Bernd Goebel, you can see a 20-year-old Bach seated in what can best be described as an unceremonial position, right in the market square. Bach's Arnstadt job came officially to an end after he was reproved or disciplined for, quote, prolonged absence and improper playing. The prolonged absence is one of music history's greatest stories. Bach walked 250 miles from Arnstadt to the city of Lübeck in November 1705 to hear the most famous organist of the day, Dietrich Buxtehude. I think we have to continue to remind ourselves that there were no recordings or MP3 downloads back then. So if you wanted to hear something or you wanted to hear someone play, you had to go and hear it live. And if you didn't have the money for a carriage, you walked. Bach went, he walked, and he stayed in Lübeck for a long time, 4 months to be exact. That's a long time to play hooky. And while he was there, he absorbed even more new ideas that influenced his creative mind, resulting in more improper playing, according to the Arnstadt consistory. Bach's case wasn't helped by a famous brawl he got into when he called one of Arnstadt's town bassoonists a nanny-goat bassoonist. It's true, the bassoonist had called Bach a dirty dog, and it ended up with both of them drawing daggers. That's not how church organists were supposed to behave. So it's not surprising that it was time to move on, which Bach did, right to a new job as an organist in the town of Mühlhausen. The job at that station lasted only a year. Bach quickly realized that it was a dead-end job, and he requested to be let out of his contract in order to take a much more attractive job as court organist and chamber musicus at the town of Weimar, the most important job of his career thus far, and the one that promised to be his dream job. Weimar, in the eastern part of today's Germany, is an extraordinary place. We'll visit it several times in the course of our studies. When Bach took the position there as court organist and chamber musicus in 1708, Weimar was a sleepy provincial town with about 5,000 residents. Its glory days lay ahead of it. But at least there Bach was working for a real duke, Duke Wilhelm Ernst of Saxony-Weimar. Duke Wilhelm was a strongly religious ruler who was extravagant with his spending on music, art, and theater. This duke appreciated Bach's talents, but he did not appreciate Bach's modern bent, meaning Bach's desire to incorporate the latest musical styles from Italy and France into his music. He also didn't appreciate Bach's independent nature. Remember, musicians were part of the servant class. But coming to Weimar was nice, especially at first. Bach had a cousin who was the big-wig musician in Weimar for a long time, from 1707 until his death in 1748. Johann Gottfried Walter was engaged as city organist. Walter's music in those days was better regarded than his newcomer cousin, and Walter also seemed to know how to stay in a job without causing an upset. Walter played primarily at the St. Peter and Paul Church in Weimar, today called the Stadtkirche, the city church, or the Herderkirche, a nickname that honors the brilliant writer and Lutheran theologian Johann Gottfried Herder, who preached at that church for nearly 30 years in the late 18th century. The St. Peter and Paul Church is a big tourist attraction. Founded in the middle of the 13th century as a parish church, the present late Gothic structure dates from about 1500. The interior decor is much like what Bach saw when he walked across the square to visit his organist cousin. But tourists flock there today, not so much for the architecture or to visit the site where Bach's cousin Walter played, but rather to take a look at this. One of the German Renaissance's greatest artworks, an altarpiece with 3 panels called a triptych, painted by Lucas Cranach, known as Cranach the Elder, with finishing touches by his son, also Lucas Cranach or Cranach the Younger. This work is so famous, people will arrive in Weimar on a tour bus, get off the bus, go in and see the altarpiece in the church, get back on the bus, and leave. They may be missing most of what Weimar has to offer, but as far as these art lovers are concerned, they've seen it all. Bach's situation in Weimar was mixed. On the one hand, he married Maria Barbara, who bore him 7 children, 4 of whom survived. 2 of those 4 children went on to become very famous composers in the next generation. In fact, those children are mentioned on an important plaque, which does its best to alert tourists to the presence of Bach in this city by recalling the Renaissance guest house, which served as Bach's home while he lived in Weimar.
Bach lived here when he was in Weimar. Here right now means a wall behind which is a parking lot, but it was the Erbprinz Hotel. And a lot of his children were born here as well, including C.P.E. Bach, Carl Philipp Emanuel.
Not only is the Erbprinz Hotel gone, but the palace where Bach worked has changed too.
This is also the same palace where J.S. Bach worked, although since his time it burned, has been rebuilt, reconstructed, new facades, new designs, but it's the courtyard and he would have walked across it many times.
The court chapel is gone, not because of bombings during World War II, as you might guess, but because of something equally deadly for buildings: fire. That fire in 1774, a half-century after Bach left, destroyed the chapel where the Weimar dukes regularly assembled to worship while Bach played and conducted the music up above their heads. Gone was his beautiful high choir and organ loft, nicknamed Himmelberg, or Heaven's Mountain. What a pity. The palace itself has also undergone so many renovations. The only thing Bach likely would recognize is this structure, a medieval tower that served as a prison. In fact, Bach would be imprisoned in that tower during his last weeks in Weimar. What? Imprisoned? Yes, and here's what happened. Bach's principal problem in Weimar was that he failed to get the highest position at the court, Kapellmeister or chapelmaster. A Kapellmeister at court was in charge of far more than a chapel. He oversaw all of the music, the church music, the orchestra music, even the music for the city, the opera, and the theater, and that's the job Sebastian Bach wanted. He was promoted in 1714 to second in command, or Concertmeister, but when that top job came open and was given to someone else, Bach decided to leave. Only he didn't have permission to leave. You see, we're back to this recurring theme. Musicians for most of history have been servants. That's right, servants. They were not free agents. They served at the pleasure of their masters, and they did whatever they were hired to do, when and where they were hired to do it, until they were officially released from doing it. They wore court uniforms to work, admittedly sometimes fancy ones when compared to kitchen workers or stable boys, but still court uniforms. They could petition to be released from contracts or traded, but they had to follow proper channels. Actually, a fair analogy would be professional athletes today who are under contract and must go through quite a bit of legal maneuvering before they can get out of one sports franchise and into another one. Except, of course, those athletes are usually pretty wealthy, and they frequently end up manipulating their contracts as they please, don't they? Well, Bach didn't maneuver out of his Weimar contract nearly as well as today's NBA stars. What he did do was, on his own, approach the Duke at a nearby court called Curtin, about 60 miles up the road, and ask to be given the position of Kapellmeister there. He was hired, and then he went and he told the Duke of Weimar he was leaving. Things don't work that way. Well, they didn't work that way for him. The Weimar Duke arrested him in December of 1717 and tossed him down in the dungeon. Well, actually, he tossed him up into the tower. Bach was under arrest for about a month, more to make the point really than to punish him. Once released, Bach got out of town quickly before the Duke changed his mind. He hightailed it up to Curtin, where he assumed a position at a much more glittering court than the court of Weimar. And a much more interesting one for him, too. Why? Because the Duke of Curtin, Prince Leopold of Anhalt-Curtin, was a real music lover. And Bach wasn't hired just for church music in this station. Rather, the Duke of Curtin wanted him to create chamber music in the newest styles for the Duke's social events. Finally, at Curtin, Bach was able to hear the newest music coming from Italy and France, and he wasted little time incorporating these ideas into his pieces. His famous and delightful Brandenburg concertos were written at Curtin. But Bach had sadness here too. He was away on a trip when his wife, Maria Barbara, died suddenly in 1720. Bach remarried quickly, as would have been expected in his day, to a court singer, Anna Magdalena. She's known to many people today because of a set of sweet keyboard pieces that Bach wrote for her entitled the Anna Magdalena Notebook. Together, they had 13 more children. But as had happened in Bach's positions before, things changed again. His music-friendly Duke died, and the son who assumed power had different interests. In the new dukedom, music took a secondary or even tertiary place. Bach saw the handwriting on the wall, we might say, and by 1722, he started looking for a new position. He found that position in Leipzig, a city which today is known as the city of Bach all over the world, but it almost wasn't. Bach was not the first or the second choice for the job or even the third. He simply didn't have a deep enough resume to wow the hiring committee. But when the more desirable folks ahead of him did not take the job, the committee was left with the dregs, Johann Sebastian Bach. It's hard to believe that story when we stand inside of the Thomaskirche, the St. Thomas Church, the church most closely associated today with Bach's spirit. Such a beautiful place. And the story of Bach continues when we go outside of the church. Bach would be delighted to see his monument right in front of the Thomaskirche, and he'd be delighted to know that people come from all over the world to take his picture. This acknowledges not only his role in German music, but his role in music everywhere in the world. But I think he'd be pleased if he saw that pocket turned out, because it acknowledges to everyone the fact that Bach was never very well paid, and something he stayed always a little angry about. In fact, Bach was in charge of the music elsewhere in Leipzig, including the gorgeous Nikolaikirche, or St. Nicholas Church. In addition, he was hired as town music director, so in essence, he had many jobs, including his responsibility for teaching at the Thomaskirche school and directing its boys' choir. And it's with this job that we most often associate Bach, director of the St. Thomas Church Boys' Choir. It is still famous today, in part because of their excellent singing, but more to the point because so long ago their hair director was J.S. Bach. We know from his letters that Bach spent exhausting hours forcing difficult music into the heads of talented, well-trained, but not always focused little boys. While the buildings that housed the school and dormitories where Bach worked no longer stand, the institution of the St. Thomas Boys' Choir is very much alive and well today. Competition is intense, but once accepted, the boys are assured a fine education, plus enviable opportunities to travel and to sing around the world. As he got older, Bach was able to leave some of his irritating duties behind, including the daily grind with the boys' choir. His interests had changed, too. He became fascinated by new developments in instrumental music. He began writing music for ensembles not officially connected with his job. These ensembles were performing in public places like, gasp, the new coffee houses. In fact, these musical ensembles spearheaded a whole new movement sweeping across Europe, public music making, or to use our terms, the beginning of the public concert. Starting around 1700, in particular cities, groups of musicians had begun assembling regularly to play in what were called collegia musica. It doesn't translate exactly. Musical colleges, or better, friendly gatherings of musicians. They read through the latest music. They honed their skills, and they basically enjoyed themselves. By the 18th century, Europe was witnessing phenomenal growth of a middle class, and particularly an affluent merchant class. These people imitated the aristocracy, and they were able to afford homes and a few of life's luxuries, such as music. They wanted to learn to read, to play, and to sing music. They wanted to buy instruments, and they organized social events with music. And while music continued to be made primarily at home, increasingly there were also public gatherings for music making, events that had tickets. These public gatherings were the cradle of today's concerts. Why was the public aspect so critical? Because anyone with money in his pocket and decent enough clothes could attend. You didn't have to be royalty or a royally invited guest to hear music. You could actually buy a ticket. It may not seem revolutionary, but it was one of the most revolutionary things that ever happened in Western music. But back to Bach. I love to say that. For at least one last round. Bach's last years in Leipzig were pretty entertaining. He had some health problems, and he had some other bureaucratic headaches, but he was also witnessing the significant success of several sons. Johann Christian Bach became famous for writing symphonies in London, no less. That would have been impressive in those days. The son of an ordinary German Kapellmeister making it big in London. Another son, Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, or CPE Bach as he's known, was working for the most progressive monarch in Europe, Frederick the Great, in his court in Berlin and often at his pleasure palace outside of Berlin known as Sanssouci. More about this in the next unit, but suffice it to say that Bach's son CPE had a very high-profile job. And Bach visited him, particularly in a famous visit in 1747, where he explored a lot of the new musical ideas at that court, despite what was considered his own advanced age back then. Bach even developed a fondness for the newest keyboard instrument to make a splash, the forte piano, which we have already mentioned. It hadn't begun to displace the long-established harpsichord, at least not yet, but it would in the next 20 or 30 years. And if Bach had lived on, no doubt he would have written a lot of pieces for the forte piano. One final piece of music by Bach we should talk about. It's also a cantata in form, but it takes a different twist, and it is totally fun, as you can guess from its title, the Coffee Cantata. Well, remember we said that a cantata can be sacred or secular, depending on the text. And this one is definitely secular. Written for the Leipzig coffee house scene in 1735, Bach took on the newest fad, the drinking of coffee. What, you say? Coffee was new? Well, not in the Arab world, where it was regarded both as a medicine and as a pleasurable stimulant. But it had just made it to Europe in the 17th century, and it brought with it an entirely new social scene. We'll call it the Starbucks culture of the 17th century. Look, Starbucks proves that so-called exotic things can become mainstream culture. Not that long ago, most people hadn't heard of a latte, and now McDonald's sells them along with their Big Macs. The first public coffee house in Leipzig opened in 1685. Hey, that's the same year Bach was born down in Eisenach. It makes sense that Leipzig became a center of the coffee culture because Leipzig was a free trade city and not a city dominated by a royal court. It was trendy, wealthy, and it tolerated a certain amount of liberal city behavior. The great Saxon king August the Strong was said to have enjoyed strong coffee and allegedly gave the proprietor of Zum Arabischer Kaffeebaum, a coffee house, an oriental painting to hang over the entrance. Zum Arabischer Kaffeebaum, the oldest preserved coffee house in Leipzig, and it's a beautiful place today. Coffee house, cafe, and museum. You can make your comparisons to the hip Starbucks today if you want, and that works pretty well. But in these coffee houses, a lot of wild things were going on, very modern. Poets, writers, artists, musicians, thinkers, just plain interested people would come together in these kinds of coffee houses, and they would sit and they would discuss and they would argue and they would drink this new forbidden beverage, well, risque if you will, coffee. And here a lot of new music was performed. I would say, try to imagine what it must have been like there, but you don't have to because it's still in business today, as you see, serving coffee, pub food, and gorgeous pastries. Plus, we can look at engravings from the period that show people gathered in small rooms or on terraces or in courtyards behind the coffee houses. They are drinking this new, highly stimulating, slightly naughty beverage called coffee. And they are socializing, sometimes more freely than the etiquette of the day would allow. The waitresses in these coffee houses were called coffee hussies by those who disapproved, and everyone knew that there were billiards and gambling. But, and this is important, many of the era's greatest minds gathered there. Writers, statesmen, artists. And by the 18th century, there were weekly public concerts with the finest new music, performed by the most eminent players and conductors. Still, it remained a bit edgy to go to the coffee houses, particularly for women. And that's exactly the situation at the core of Bach's Coffee Cantata, a work carefully crafted by a now senior Bach and conducted by that distinguished man in his favorite Leipzig coffee house, the Zimmermann Coffee House. The Coffee Cantata was based on a popular poem, remember, prima le parole e dopo la musica. Bach thought it had the makings of a delightful short musical drama. The story is simple. A father reprimands his daughter for sneaking off to a coffee house. "You must stop," he says, "or no decent man will ever marry you." The daughter thinks it over during a couple of recitatives and arias and decides she'd rather have her coffee than a husband. At the end, father and daughter, joined by the narrator, sing a charming trio to the accompaniment of a small Baroque ensemble, the kind of ensemble that could easily fit on the terrace of a coffee house. I like using this cantata as an example of the Bach cantatas. No, I realize it isn't his greatest work, nor can it begin to convey the extraordinary power of Bach's sacred cantatas, which are treasures of Western church music. But if you understand how this cantata works, then it's pretty easy to understand how they all work. And because it's a fun story and bouncy music, it's a little easier to grab onto, I think. And so, with this sprightly chorus from the Coffee Cantata, we've covered all of Bach's stations. And by doing so, we've told his story. So let's end our discussion of Bach by returning to Eisenach and the Bach House Museum, sometimes called his birthhouse, although it's not. His birthhouse presumably stood on the same block as the museum, and it probably looked a lot like it. The second and third floors, what the Europeans call the first and second floors, are set up today to show what homes looked like in Bach's time. The rooms are small, the staircase is twisty, almost insurmountable, and the passageways narrow. The bottom, or ground floor, is used today as a small concert hall for demonstrating instruments of Bach's time, period instruments as they're called. Some are original, and some are reconstructed, but they all give you an idea of just how things sounded back then. One thing you can hear demonstrated is a clavichord. It was the keyboard instrument that most people had at home for practicing and composing. It's like a tabletop keyboard, and it's very old. The sound is triggered by a small metal tangent rising when the key is depressed, and it touches or slightly bows a string. The sound produced is very, very quiet. Clavichords were the primary practice instruments in homes, where they were perfect for small quarters. But the main thing about a clavichord is this: the player controls the expressiveness of the resulting sound by regulating how the finger will strike the key. To use musical terms, the player controlled the volume, the dynamics, and the sound quality. These things could not be controlled at an individual key level on a harpsichord, that keyboard instrument that you heard most often out in public, especially in courts and theaters. Nor could they be controlled on an organ at an individual key level. And these qualities of expression became far more important during the last years of Bach's life. Plus, Bach's son, C.P.E. Bach, who will make his career working for Frederick the Great up in Berlin, adored the clavichord and used its sensitivity to guide his compositional style. CPE embraced the new forte pianos too, because they also allowed for the same kind of sensitivity, only with a much bigger sound than the clavichord. In our next unit, we'll revisit this issue of sensitivity in music and give it a long German name. Well, I hope you can visit the Bach House someday. There's a very nice cafe right across the road from it where you can enjoy pastries, ice cream, and coffee drinks like lattes and cappuccinos. And since you'll probably be combining your visit to the Bach House with a trek up the mountain to the Wartburg Castle, which figures prominently in our discussion on Romanticism, you're going to need the energy.
I think one of the interesting things about playing the organ is we actually have manuals and keyboards we play with our feet. So anything that I can play with my hands, I can play with my feet. It takes a lot of athleticism and coordination, but it pays off in the end.